Around 25 years ago, I read about a Holocaust survivor in the local newspaper. I contacted him and he was gracious enough to meet with me. And then he came and spoke to an assembly at the K-12 school where I was teaching. It was a powerful experience. But as time goes on, there are fewer Holocaust survivors alive. So when I read about a local Chabad center, which is a branch of Judaism, offering a talk with a Holocaust survivor, I knew that I wanted to go and to take my daughter, because this may be the only time in her life when she would have an opportunity to hear the story from an actual survivor. And it was so impacting. For today's episode, join me as I retell the story of Holocaust survivor Eva Schneider, based on my memory and also copious notes that I took during her presentation. I can't possibly do her story justice, but I think it's important to share because there are lessons to be learned that we should never forget. Eva Schneider was born in Slovakia. She was the only child of her Jewish mother and father. She had a happy childhood, but when she was only 8 years old, she began to learn the meaning of bias and persecution. Her mother pinned a yellow star onto her clothes and told her that she had to wear it. Some type of law was also passed that allowed people to hit and to spit on Jews. So her mother cautioned her to walk close to the buildings when she walked to and from school. This went on for about a year, and then when she was 9 years old, one day there was a knock on her family's door, and they were told that they had 24 hours to vacate their home. They had to leave their house and leave behind all of their furniture, rugs and paintings, and vacate with bare belongings. They moved into a house with a Christian family, and the small family of 3 squeezed into one room. Prior to this, Eva's father had been able to save and set aside some money. Many Jewish people had begun hiding money in their shoes or sewing it into areas of their clothing so that they would have money to bribe officials if needed. With some of this money, Eva's father paid for the family to be smuggled into Budapest in Hungary. Her father found a job. They sublet a small room from a family, and they paid for Eva to have a tutor since she couldn't go to school. The family was safe in this situation for about a year. But then the Germans marched into Hungary. One day her father went to work, and he didn't come home. Eva and her mother were sure that he had been arrested. With nowhere to go and no source of income, Eva's mother paid for them to be smuggled back into Slovakia, but they didn't have access to a vehicle, so they had to walk. When they arrived, they went to an uncle's house. The uncle was employed by a Swiss man who ran a brewery. The Swiss man allowed Eva and her mother to live hidden in the attic of the brewery. But there was no ventilation, no windows, sawdust on the floor, rats and mice, and no bathroom. They had to go to the bathroom in one corner of the attic and then cover it up with sawdust. They ate food from boxes and cans because there was no way to warm the food. They were only allowed to shower once a week because of the risk of being caught. And sure enough, one of the times when they were showering, they were captured. They were marched down the main street with other Jewish people and loaded into cattle cars. They were being taken to Auschwitz. Located in southern Poland, in a portion of the country that was annexed by Germany at the beginning of World War II, Auschwitz was the Nazis' largest concentration camp and extermination camp. It was actually 3 camps in one: a prison camp, a slave labor camp, and an extermination camp. It was the most lethal of the extermination camps. Between 1.1 and 1.5 million people died at Auschwitz alone, and 90% of them were Jews. Somehow, Eva's mother must have heard reports of what was happening to Jewish people, because during the ride in the cattle car, she told Eva what might happen to them. She wanted her daughter to be prepared, so she explained how the gas chambers work. When they arrived at Auschwitz, they expected to go through a division process called selection. The young and the able-bodied were sent to work. Young children and their mothers, and the old and the infirm, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Thousands of prisoners were also selected by the camp doctor, Joseph Mengele, for barbaric medical experiments. When Eva and her mother arrived at Auschwitz, they first went to a station and had to completely strip off all of their clothes. Then they walked single file in front of soldiers to a second station where their heads were shaved and their bodily hair was completely shaved. Then they went to a third station where they were tattooed with a number. Last, they went to a room with shower heads. At this point, her mother thought that they might survive, because why would the soldiers have shaved them and tattooed them if they were going to kill them? And sure enough, when the shower heads turned on, it was water that came out and not gas. Eva spoke about 3 miracles that contributed to her survival during the Holocaust, and this was the first miracle. She explained that German commandos forced Jewish people in the concentration camp to load the dead bodies from the gas chambers and to take them to the incinerators. Many of them went mad doing it, or if they refused, then they were shot or gassed. But there had been some type of bombing that had occurred, and the Nazis were afraid that what they were doing might become more known, because many people didn't know exactly what was happening in the concentration camps. So the Nazis had stopped gassing people at Auschwitz on November 1st. 2 days later, Eva showed up with her mother, and they were the first transport of Jewish people to not be gassed. It was a miracle. In the concentration camp, there were 6 people to a cot, like a bunk. There was no mattress, and the group of 6 people had to share one blanket. Regardless of the weather, every morning they had to go outside and line up to be counted. Then they would get their breakfast, which was a bowl of brown liquid and a slice of bread. If they were lucky, there might be a potato in it. In the evening, they got the same thing for dinner: a bowl of brown liquid and a piece of bread. One day, Eva's mother was taken away. Before her mother left, she turned to Eva and said, "If they don't shoot me or hang me, I will live, and you do your best to live too." And then her mother was taken away, and Eva was left alone without any family or friends in a concentration camp, cold and starving at just 11 years old. So let's pause for a moment and think about what our lives were like at 11 years old. Personally, I was raised on a beautiful ranch by 2 loving parents with lots of siblings. At 11, I was busy with school and sports and 4-H. We got to go on family trips, and I got to spend lots of time with my friends. I was interested in boys and clothes. And compare that to an 11-year-old girl in a foreign country with no friends or family, cold and starving, surrounded by death, and people just trying to survive, who had committed no crime except to be born Jewish. In the face of the approaching Red Army offensive in the second half of 1944, the Nazis began systematically evacuating Auschwitz prisoners and sending them to other camps. Eva was part of a march of about 7,000 people. It was January in Poland in 1945. They had no shoes and no warm clothing. They were walking skeletons. They marched for a week. Sometimes they slept in the snow, and Eva remembers spending one night in a barn in which she snuggled up to a horse for warmth. For those who couldn't make it, they would just sit down. They would either be shot or left behind to freeze. During this march is when the second miracle occurred. A young SS soldier started walking beside Eva and then handed her a brown paper bag. She peeked inside, and it was sugar. Before she could thank him, he was gone. As she walked, she would wet her finger and dip it in the sugar, and then lick the sugar from her finger. In a world where there was very little kindness, this was a huge act of kindness, and it may have helped her survive the long march. When they reached their destination, Eva, along with others, was put into an open cattle car. Again, this was January, and there was no roof for protection. It was all men crammed into a cattle car with Eva. And she said that the men were very respectful toward her and protected her. They were crammed in the cattle cars for 3 days until they reached a new extermination camp, Mauthausen in Austria. When Eva got out of the cattle car, the first thing she saw was a massive pile of dead bodies. And one of the dead was a little boy whose eyes were still open, looking at her. She said that even today she can't get the image out of her head. Eva was taken to a barracks, but it was nicer than ones she'd seen before. It was more like a house. A kind woman greeted her and bathed her to get rid of the lice. She was also given clean clothes. She had been in the same clothes for the past 3 months. Then the kind woman sat her down and talked to her. She explained what type of place it was. It was a brothel. Eva didn't understand things like that at only 11 years old, but once the woman gently explained it to her, Eva didn't care if she had a warm cot and warm blankets. She would rather die than do that. The next day, she was sent to a doctor to get a full checkup. After being inspected by him, she got on her knees and pleaded with him. She told him that she was just skin and bones. You could even see her ribs and count them. And she was only 11 years old, so no one would want her. She must have been convincing, because the next day she was taken away from the brothel. And this was the third miracle. God had spared her. She was taken away on a bus to another concentration camp. There was an ammunitions factory. While she was there, the female SS guards were very, very cruel. But on Eva's birthday, when she turned 12 years old, one of them surprised her with the gift of a piece of bread with marmalade on it. And in that type of environment, even the smallest act of kindness was a big deal. Around this time, the prisoners at the concentration camp were hearing bits and pieces of news about the Allies getting closer, and they prayed to be rescued. One day, Eva looked out the window of the factory and saw one of the SS guards go into a bush wearing their uniform and come out of the bush wearing normal clothes. Then they eventually noticed that the SS guards were all gone. It was May 5th, 1945, and 3 soldiers came running toward them. They were British, French, and American soldiers, and they were yelling, "You're free! You're free!" Eva said that even thinking about that moment still brings tears to her eyes 80 years later. A bunch of Allied soldiers arrived. They brought food and clothes, but the clothes were too big because the people were skeletons. Eva was 12 years old and weighed only 54 pounds. And the first food that they were offered wasn't very appetizing. It was a truckload of raw bacon. Eva was kept with other former prisoners in a town for about a month, and then she was able to return to her hometown. When she got there, she had to go to a building to register because families were trying to find each other. Because of all the trauma, Eva could remember her parents' names, but she had forgotten what they looked like. So she didn't know if she would even recognize them if she saw them. But then she saw a man whom she did recognize, and she approached him and told him who she was. And he told her that her father was still alive. Her father had bribed people to be kept in a prison and not a concentration camp. And then he was able to hide in a Jesuit monastery. And when he was finally able to return home, the man who had been given her father's business by the Nazis gave it back to her father after the war. Someone went and got her dad and told him that his daughter Eva was alive, and they were reunited. Her father said that her mother was alive too. He had received a letter from her and she was coming home. Her mother had been sent to work in an airplane factory. And Eva's mother liked to say that Hitler lost the war because she made his airplane parts. Eventually, the family was reunited, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy. Eva said that her family didn't talk about the past. They just looked forward and tried to return to a normal life. In fact, her father told her, "You have survived hell and have a new life now, so make the best of it." From the age of 8 to the age of 12, Eva's life had been tragically altered, but she had survived. She eventually married and had children and grandchildren. At the presentation my daughter and I attended, Eva introduced her husband, and they have been married more than 60 years. But not all of her family was as lucky. She lost more than 30 members of her extended family in the Holocaust. When asked about what she learned from the experience of the Holocaust, Eva mentioned several good life principles. One is to save your energy for the really important things. She told a funny story about showing up at a fancy event, and she happened to be wearing the same gown as another woman at the event, and the other woman got all bent out of shape about it. But Eva said it was no big deal. After staring death in the face and surviving, it helps you put things in perspective, and you don't sweat the small stuff. Other principles to live by are to never give up, to wake up grateful every day, and to make the most of our lives. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. And until next time, take care and God bless.